Somewhere in the region of Galatia, a man is standing at the edge of a decision that will follow him for the rest of his life. He has already believed in Jesus. He has already been baptized. He has already tasted something real, a peace he did not manufacture, a joy that was not there before. But now men have come from somewhere else, and they are telling him something that sounds almost right. Faith in Christ was a wonderful beginning, they say, but if he wants to be fully counted among the people of God, there is one more step, a physical mark, a visible proof. He does not know it yet, but he is standing inside one of the oldest traps in the history of faith. The trap does not ask you to leave Jesus. It asks you to keep Jesus and add something beside him. Just one more requirement, just one more sign that you are serious, just one more thing to prove. You have probably never faced that exact pressure, but you know the feeling underneath it. You know what it is like to sit in a service and wonder if you sang with enough feeling, to serve every week and still feel like the count is not high enough, to read your Bible and immediately think about whether you read it long enough. Somewhere along the way, faith quietly turned into an audition, and nobody sent you the memo. 2,000 years ago, a man named Paul picked up a pen, and he did not write gently. He wrote like someone whose friends were about to lose everything that mattered. What he wrote down became one letter in a very old book, but the question underneath it is not old at all. What if the trap was never that you are failing at faith? What if the trap is that you have spent years trying to perform what you were always meant to simply receive? 30 lessons, one letter, a trap most people do not know they are standing in. Let us start where the letter starts. Not with comfort, with urgency. Picture a small room in one of the towns of Galatia. Walls thick enough to keep out the afternoon heat. A handful of believers gathered close together because a letter has arrived and someone needs to read it out loud. This was not unusual. Paul wrote letters the way modern people send long voice messages to someone they love, and those letters got passed from hand to hand, read publicly, treated almost like the presence of the man himself standing in the room. Everyone in that gathering had heard letters from Paul before. They knew the rhythm. They knew what usually came first. Paul often opened his letters with some form of thanksgiving. To the believers in Rome, he thanked God for their faith being spoken of everywhere. To the church in Corinth, as chaotic and broken as it was, he thanked God for the grace given to them in Christ. To the believers in Philippi, he thanked God every time he remembered them. And he said it with joy. Whatever correction or challenge waited further down the page, Paul usually opened with warmth. It was almost a signature. You could recognize his voice before you even reached the point. And then this letter arrived in Galatia, and the warmth was gone. There is no thanksgiving. There is no gentle transition. Paul identifies himself, states plainly that his authority came directly from Jesus and not from any human committee. And within a handful of lines, he says something that must have landed like cold water on a room that was expecting comfort. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you. Astonished, not disappointed, in the soft way a parent says it when they still mostly approve. Astonished the way you sound when you walk into a room and find something on fire that you thought was perfectly safe 5 minutes ago. Read that sentence again slowly and notice what it does not say. It does not say, I am astonished that you are sinning. It does not say, I am astonished that you have stopped believing in God. It says you are deserting the one who called you, and you are doing it quickly. And the word quickly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. This was not a slow drift over decades. This was fast. Someone showed up in Galatia with a message that sounded close enough to the gospel to be mistaken for it. And within what appears to be a very short window of time, people who had genuinely tasted grace were already reaching for something else to stand on. Lesson 1 begins right here. In this missing greeting, the absence of comfort is sometimes the clearest evidence of love in the room. A person who does not care what happens to you will let you keep making the mistake in peace. A person who loves you enough to lose sleep over you will interrupt the pleasantries and tell you the truth while there is still time to turn around. Think about what it would have taken for Paul to skip the Thanksgiving. This was a man who had walked through Galatia on foot, who had preached to these exact people while suffering from what he later describes as a bodily illness. Something painful enough that he calls it a trial to them. And yet they received him. In his own words, as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. There was real affection here, real history. And Paul set all of it aside because the situation did not have room for pleasantries. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because most people assume urgency and love pull in opposite directions. We tend to think the loving response is always the gentle one, the patient one, the one that takes its time getting to the hard part. But there are moments when gentleness would actually be a form of abandonment. If your house is on fire and someone calmly finishes their coffee before mentioning it, that person has not been kind to you. They have been negligent, dressed up as polite. Paul was not being harsh because he had stopped loving the Galatians. He was being urgent because he had not. Now here is the second thing this opening reveals. And it is easy to miss if you only skim the surface of what Paul is angry about. He does not say, "You have stopped believing in Jesus." He says, "You are deserting the one who called you for a different gospel," which is really no gospel at all. There is a difference between those two accusations, and the difference matters more than it might seem. Nobody in Galatia had walked into the marketplace and announced they no longer believed in Jesus. Nobody had renounced their baptism or denied the resurrection. What was happening was quieter and, in some ways, far more dangerous than open rejection would have been. They were keeping Jesus. They were simply being convinced that Jesus, on his own, was not quite enough. That there was one more requirement standing between them and full acceptance into the family of God. And because Jesus was still technically present in the conversation, it did not feel like betrayal. It felt like maturity. It felt like taking faith seriously enough to add the finishing touches. This is where lesson 2 takes shape. The most dangerous threat to your faith rarely announces itself as the enemy of your faith. It usually arrives sounding like an upgrade. Nobody in Galatia woke up one morning and decided to abandon grace. What happened was slower and far more persuasive than that. Someone came in with confidence, with credentials, with what looked like a deeper commitment to Scripture. And they suggested, gently at first, that believing in Jesus was a wonderful start. But a serious believer would want to go further. A serious believer would want the mark that proved it. A serious believer would not want to seem like they were taking a shortcut. That is how the trap works. It rarely asks you to leave the faith. It asks you to add one more thing to it. And it frames that addition as devotion rather than distortion. This is why Paul does not waste a single sentence on comfort before he names what is happening. He knows that if he starts gently, if he eases into the correction the way most of us would, the Galatians will have already convinced themselves this is simply a deeper level of commitment rather than a departure from the gospel altogether. He has to interrupt the momentum immediately, before politeness gives the deception room to finish its work. There is something almost merciful in how abrupt this letter is. Paul is not trying to make the Galatians feel comfortable in this moment. He is trying to wake them up before the trap closes all the way. Some letters comfort you because they are gentle. This one comforts you because it refuses to let you keep sleeping through something that could cost you everything. And if you have ever needed someone to interrupt your own polite momentum towards something that was quietly pulling you away from grace, you already understand exactly what kind of love this letter is. There is a particular kind of danger that does not look dangerous at all, and Paul spends the rest of his opening trying to describe it. He calls it a different gospel, and then, almost as if he can hear someone objecting, he corrects himself in the same breath. Not that there is another gospel. There is no such thing. What is happening in Galatia is not a rival religion showing up with a different God and a different Savior. It is something far harder to spot. Some people, Paul says, are throwing the church into confusion and trying to distort the gospel of Christ. Distort, not replace. Distort. This word choice matters more than almost anything else in the letter. A counterfeit that looks nothing like the original fools. Nobody. If someone walked into Galatia and said, "Forget Jesus, worship this instead," the church would have recognized the threat immediately and thrown the man out before he finished his sentence. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter, and it is the version of this trap that still catches people today. The men who came to Galatia did not ask anyone to stop believing in Jesus. From what we can tell by Paul's response, they still agreed that Jesus mattered, still spoke his name with reverence, still used language that would have sounded completely orthodox in the room. And then they added one sentence to the end of it. Something like this: "All of that is wonderful. And now, to be fully counted among the people of God, you also need to be circumcised according to the law of Moses." One sentence. That is all it took. Lesson 3. Lives right here. The most dangerous counterfeit is never the one that removes Christ completely. It is the one that keeps Christ and quietly adds something beside him. It is worth pausing here to be precise about what was actually being argued in Galatia, because this story gets told wrong more often than almost any other part of the New Testament. This was not a fight between religion and grace in some general sense. It was a specific and painful conversation happening inside a very young, very mixed community about who counted as fully belonging to the people of God. Circumcision was not a random ritual. It was the sign given to Abraham generations earlier, the physical mark carried by the covenant people, and for many Jewish believers in Jesus, it was simply unthinkable that a Gentile could be a full member of God's family without also carrying that sign. This was not, from where they stood, an attack on grace. It felt like faithfulness to everything Scripture had always said. Paul does not treat these men as villains twirling their mustaches in the shadows. He treats them as dangerously sincere. That is what makes the whole situation so hard to untangle. And it is exactly why the church in Galatia was struggling to see the problem. Sincerity is not the same thing as truth. A person can be completely convinced they are protecting the gospel, while they are quietly rebuilding a wall the cross had already torn down. Here is what Paul understood with total clarity, even when almost nobody around him did. If you tell a Gentile believer that faith in Christ is necessary but not sufficient, that they also need the mark of the Old Covenant to be fully accepted, you have not added a helpful requirement to the gospel. You have quietly announced that the finished work of Jesus was, in fact, unfinished. You have told people that the cross got them most of the way there, and now it is up to them to close the remaining distance. Lesson 4 follows a similar shape. Almost the gospel is not a smaller version of the gospel. It is a different gospel, wearing the same face. This is not only a first-century problem, and it would be a mistake to leave it there, safely locked away in ancient history, where it cannot touch anyone watching this today. The specific requirement changes with every generation, but the shape of the trap does not. Nobody stands up in a modern church and says, "Stop believing in Jesus." That would be too obvious, too easy to reject. What happens instead is quieter and far more persuasive. Someone suggests, in 100 different soft ways, that Jesus is the beginning, and now, to really be counted among the serious ones, you need something more. You need the right amount of certainty, the right emotional response at the altar, the right number of hours serving, the right posture of guilt when you fail, the right vocabulary, the right causes, the right image of what a committed believer is supposed to look like from the outside. None of those things announce themselves as the enemy of grace. They announce themselves as devotion. That is what makes them so effective. And that is exactly why Paul refuses to let the Galatians ease into this conversation. He knows that if this trap sounded dangerous, nobody would fall for it. It only works because it sounds like commitment. This is worth stopping on for a moment, because it deserves its own clarity before we go any further. This letter is not an attack on prayer, on scripture reading, on obedience, on discipline, or on any visible act of devotion. Paul is not describing those things as the problem. He is describing what happens the moment those good things quietly stop being an overflow of belonging and start becoming the evidence you use to prove you have earned it. That is the actual target of everything that follows in this letter. Lesson 5 is the quietest one in this chapter, and it might be the most important. Religious pressure rarely shouts. It usually whispers something that sounds almost like encouragement. Yes, Jesus saves you, but you still need to prove you are the right kind of believer. There is a phrase worth carrying through the rest of this letter, because it will keep showing up in different forms in almost every chapter that follows. The danger was never obedience. The danger was adding a second foundation beneath the cross. Paul is not writing to people who want to obey God too much. There is no such thing as that. He is writing to people who have quietly started to believe that obedience, or a mark, or a visible proof of some kind, has become the actual foundation their standing with God rests on, with Christ pushed a little to the side, still present, still spoken of warmly, but no longer doing all the weight-bearing work he was meant to do alone. This is why Paul reaches for language so strong it makes modern readers flinch when they first encounter it. Even if we, he says, or an angel from heaven, should preach a gospel other than the one already preached to you, let that person be cursed. He says it twice in the space of 2 sentences, which is not something Paul does carelessly. He is not talking about someone with a minor theological disagreement. He is talking about anyone, no matter how impressive their credentials, who tells the Galatians that Christ's finished work needs an addition before it can be trusted. That kind of language only makes sense if you understand what is actually at stake. Paul is not defending a preference. He is defending the only thing that ever actually held these people up. If the foundation shifts, even slightly, from Christ alone to Christ plus something you provide, The whole structure eventually gives way. Because a foundation you can add to is a foundation you can also lose. This is the trap most people never see coming, because it never asks them to leave their faith. It only asks them to keep adding one more thing on top of it, one small proof at a time, until they are so busy building the addition that they forget the house was already finished the moment Christ said it was. Before Paul ever wrote a single word to the Galatians about grace, he had already lived on the other side of this conversation. And if you want to understand why he writes with such urgency, you have to understand who he used to be. He tells them himself, plainly, without softening any of it, "You have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism. How intensely I persecuted the Church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." Read that slowly, because it is easy to slide past. Paul is not describing himself as a man who drifted into religious extremism out of confusion or weakness. He is describing himself as gifted at it, advancing beyond many of his own age. This was not a struggling student trying to keep up with the class. This was the top of the class, the one other students were measured against, the young man everyone in the room assumed would go the farthest. He held coats while a man named Stephen was stoned to death for preaching about Jesus. And the text tells us he approved of it. He went from house to house afterward, dragging off believers, men and women both, and throwing them into prison. Later, in his own words, he describes himself as breathing out murderous threats against the followers of Jesus. A man on his way to a city called Damascus, with letters of authority in hand, hunting down anyone who belonged to what he considered a dangerous new movement, threatening everything sacred to his people. This is the man writing the letter to Galatia. Lesson 6 sits inside this history, and it is uncomfortable enough that most people would rather skip past it. The most dangerous prison is sometimes the one that looks like devotion from the outside. There is a version of this story that gets told wrong, and it needs to be corrected clearly before we go any further. It would be easy, and it would be lazy, to hear all of this and conclude that Paul is describing his Jewish faith itself as the problem, as though the traditions of his fathers were some kind of trap he needed to escape from. That is not what he says, and it is not what he means. Paul never speaks of his heritage with contempt. Later in his life, he still calls himself an Israelite, still identifies with his people, still grieves for them with what he calls great sorrow and unceasing anguish in his heart. This was never a story about religion being the villain. The problem was never the traditions themselves. The problem was what Paul had quietly built on top of them somewhere along the way. Being the most zealous person in the room had become the thing Paul measured himself by. His identity was not simply that he belonged to God. His identity had become that he was better at belonging than everyone else, faster to advance, more intense in his zeal, more willing to go further than his peers to prove how seriously he took his faith. That is not unique to first-century Judaism. That is available to anyone in any religious system that has ever existed, including the one you might be sitting inside right now. Zeal itself is not the danger here, and this needs to be said with precision, because it is easy to get wrong in the opposite direction. Scripture never asks believers to care less, to want less, to hold back the intensity of their devotion. The danger is what zeal gets used for underneath the surface. It becomes dangerous the moment it stops being a response to God and starts being a way of proving something to yourself or to the people watching you. That distinction is lesson 7, and it may be the hardest one in this chapter to actually hold on to, because it refuses to give anyone a simple villain to point at. Think about what was actually happening inside Paul during those years before Damascus. He was not persecuting the church because he hated God. He was persecuting the church because he loved what he believed God required. And he had convinced himself that stopping this new movement was the most faithful, most zealous, most committed thing a serious follower of God could do. Every violent step he took with what he believed was a clear conscience. He was not a hypocrite pretending to be devoted while secretly doubting. He was, in his own mind, the most devoted man in the room. That is what makes this story so unsettling. And it is exactly why Paul chooses to tell it. If the most zealous man in Jerusalem could be completely, sincerely, dangerously wrong while feeling entirely righteous the whole time, then sincerity was never going to be the test that mattered. Something had to interrupt him from the outside, because nothing on the inside was going to stop him. And something did. On the road to Damascus, a light stopped him in his tracks, and a voice asked him a question that must have taken years to fully absorb. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Not, "Why do you persecute my church?" As though it were an abstract institution. "Why do you persecute me?" Jesus identified himself completely with the very people Paul was hunting down, which meant every letter of authority in Paul's satchel, every arrest he had already made, every ounce of zeal he had poured into what he believed was righteous work, had actually been aimed directly at God himself. Paul later describes what happened next in a phrase that carries the weight of everything this chapter is trying to say. "God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me." Notice what is missing from that sentence. There is no mention of Paul's zeal earning this moment. There is no mention of his advancement in Judaism qualifying him for it. The revelation came by grace, to a man who was, by his own admission, the worst of sinners at the exact moment it arrived. Everything Paul had built his identity on, the zeal, the advancement, the reputation as the most committed man of his generation, none of it was the reason this happened. If anything, it was the very thing standing directly in the way. Which brings us to lesson 8, the one that gives this entire chapter its purpose. And the reason Paul tells his own story before he tells the Galatians anything else? The person who understands religious performance most clearly is rarely the outsider looking in with suspicion. It is almost always the person who lived inside it at the highest level and finally saw what it had cost them. Paul is not lecturing the Galatians from a safe distance. He is not someone who has always found grace easy to understand, someone born comfortable with the idea that acceptance cannot be earned. He is a man who spent years of his life believing the opposite with everything he had. A man who built his entire sense of worth on being more zealous than everyone around him, only to discover that the very zeal he was proudest of had made him an enemy of the God he thought he was serving. This is why his warning to the Galatians carries so much weight. He is not asking them to avoid a mistake he has only heard about. He is asking them to avoid the exact mistake that once defined his entire life. The one he only escaped because grace interrupted him on a road he had no intention of turning back from. If you have ever measured your own worth by how devoted you appear next to the people around you, If you have ever quietly kept score of your own sincerity and let that scorekeeping become the real foundation under your feet. This chapter is not ancient history. This is Paul, before the road to Damascus, standing exactly where you might be standing right now, completely convinced he was doing the right thing, completely unaware of the prison he had built for himself, out of the very thing he was proudest of. The room goes quiet the moment Peter stands up from the table. Nobody says anything at first. He simply rises, wipes his hands, and moves toward a different group, sitting further down. The group that does not include the Gentile believers he has been eating beside for weeks. A few of the men from James have just arrived from Jerusalem, and Peter has not said a single theological word to anyone. He has just changed seats, but everyone at that first table felt it happen. This is the scene Paul drops into the middle of his letter, and it might be the most uncomfortable paragraph he ever wrote. He tells the Galatians about a time he confronted Peter, the same Peter who had walked with Jesus, the same Peter who preached the sermon at Pentecost that brought thousands of people into the faith in a single day. Paul does not soften this story for the sake of anyone's reputation. When Peter came to Antioch, he writes, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned, to his face, not behind closed doors, not in a private letter passed quietly between leaders, in front of people, at the moment it was happening, while the room was still watching. Before that moment of standing up and walking away, something remarkable had been true in Antioch. Jewish believers and Gentile believers had been eating together. This detail sounds small to modern ears, but in that world, it was enormous. Shared meals were not casual in the ancient Near East the way they can be today. Who you ate with said something about who you considered family, who you considered equal, who you considered clean enough to sit beside. For Jewish and Gentile believers, to be eating at the same table meant something had genuinely changed. It meant the gospel had done what the gospel claims to do. It had made two very different groups of people into one family. And then the men from James arrived, and Peter began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Peter did not announce a new theology. He did not stand up and declare that Gentile believers were somehow less saved than he was. He simply started eating somewhere else, quietly, gradually, and because Peter was Peter, the most recognized name among the apostles, everyone else at that table started noticing where he had gone. Paul says, even Barnabas, his own trusted partner in ministry, was led astray by this same hypocrisy. Sit with that for a second. Barnabas, the man who had vouched for Paul when the rest of the church was still afraid of him, the most generous, the most steady presence in the early chapters of the church's story. And even he found himself quietly moving his chair. Lesson 9 lives inside this exact moment, and it should unsettle anyone who assumes spiritual maturity, makes a person immune to this trap. Even an apostle, even someone who walked beside Jesus himself, can slide back into performance when the pressure of being watched becomes strong enough. This is worth sitting with, honestly, because it would be easy to read this story and simply feel superior to Peter from a safe distance of 2,000 years. But think about what was actually happening inside him in that moment. This was not a man who suddenly stopped believing that Gentiles were fully accepted by God. Paul makes that clear later, saying Peter knew that a person is not justified by works of the law. Peter understood the theology perfectly well. What failed was not his doctrine. What failed was his nerve. The moment a group of people whose opinion he feared walked into the room, That is a far more relatable failure than most people want to admit. It is one thing to believe grace is true when nobody important is watching. It is another thing entirely to keep living like it is true, when the people whose approval you have spent your whole life caring about are sitting a few feet away, silently judging who you choose to sit beside. Paul understood exactly what was at stake in that dining room. And it was not a minor disagreement about manners. He writes that Peter's actions were not in line with the truth of the gospel, not a violation of etiquette, a violation of the gospel itself. Lesson 10 follows from that, and it is one of the sharpest insights in this entire letter. The gospel is tested not only in what a person confesses with their mouth, but in who they are willing to sit beside at the table. This is the part of the story that reaches furthest into the present day, because the specific pressure has changed shape, but the underlying temptation has not moved an inch. Every community, every church, every family gathering has an invisible seating chart. Some of it is spoken, most of it is not. It shows up in who gets the easy welcome and who gets the polite distance. It shows up in whose past gets brought up quietly behind their back and whose past gets generously forgotten. It shows up in who is trusted to lead and who is only ever trusted to sit quietly in the back. A church or a person. You can preach grace beautifully from the front of a room and still practice something entirely different once the sermon ends and the coffee starts pouring. Doctrine can be flawless on paper and still be betrayed completely by where people actually choose to sit. That is exactly what Paul saw happening in Antioch. Peter's theology had not changed. His seating had. And Paul understood, with a clarity that must have cost him something to act on, that the seating was the theology now. Belief that does not reach the table is not yet belief that has finished doing its work. What Paul did next deserves attention, because confrontation of this kind is rarely comfortable and almost never convenient. He did not write a private letter to Peter expressing his concerns. He did not pull him aside quietly after everyone else had left. He addressed it publicly, in the moment, because the failure itself had been public. Peter's withdrawal from the Gentile believers had not happened in secret. It had happened in front of the whole community. And the damage it was doing was happening in front of that same community. A private correction would have fixed nothing, because the people who had watched Peter walk away from that table needed to watch the truth walk back to it. This is where lesson 11 comes from. There is something important here about what love sometimes requires. It would have been easier, and it would have felt kinder in the moment, for Paul to let this slide. Peter was older. Peter was more established. Peter had walked with Jesus in the flesh in a way Paul never had. Every social instinct would have told Paul to handle this quietly, to preserve the relationship, to avoid the discomfort of correcting a man everyone else in the room still deeply respected. Paul chose the harder path because he understood something most people would rather avoid facing. Sometimes protecting a relationship and protecting the truth are not the same task. And when they pull in opposite directions, the truth has to come first, because everything else, including the relationship itself, was only ever standing on that truth to begin with. And that brings the chapter to its final lesson. Lesson 12 might be the hardest one to actually live out. Confronting someone you respect is not automatically a failure of love. Sometimes it is the clearest evidence that love is still present at all. Paul was not trying to win an argument against Peter. He was trying to protect an entire community of Gentile believers from absorbing a message they had never been told directly, but would have understood perfectly well from watching where the most respected man in the room chose to sit. Every quiet withdrawal, Every subtle distancing, every unspoken shift in who gets treated as fully belonging, teaches something, whether anyone says a word about it or not. If you have ever felt the specific sting of watching someone you respected pull away the moment other people started watching, you already understand exactly what happened at that table in Antioch. And if you have ever been the one who quietly pulled away, afraid of what your full acceptance of someone else might cost you socially, you understand it from the other side as well. The gospel does not only live in what gets said from the front of the room, it lives, or it dies a little, in who gets welcome to the table when nobody is being tested on their theology, only on where they are actually willing to sit. Somewhere inside every person who has ever tried hard to be good, there lives a courtroom. It rarely announces itself with that kind of language. It shows up instead as a feeling that trails behind you through an ordinary Tuesday, a missed devotional in the morning, a sharp word you regret saying to someone you love, a private thought you would never say out loud. And almost without noticing, a case begins to build itself somewhere in the back of your mind. Evidence stacking up against you. A quiet voice tallying the score and wondering whether today moved you closer to acceptance or further away from it. Paul spends a large portion of this letter trying to shut that courtroom down completely. He asks the Galatians a question that must have landed like a slap after everything he had already said about Peter and Antioch. "We who are Jews by birth," he writes, "and not sinners of the Gentiles, know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law no one will be justified." Justified. It is a word that sounds like it belongs in a courtroom, because it does. It is a legal term, the kind of word a judge would use when handing down a verdict. And that is exactly the picture Paul wants the Galatians to see. Not a slow process of moral improvement that eventually earns approval. A verdict. A ruling. Something declared, not something accumulated. Lesson 13 takes shape right here, and it explains why so many sincere believers still live exhausted lives, even after they have said all the right words about grace. In a religion built on performance, every single day becomes a fresh trial. Every failure becomes evidence submitted against you. Every success becomes a fragile piece of defense you have to keep rebuilding tomorrow, because the case never actually closes. Think about what that kind of life actually feels like from the inside. You wake up already slightly behind, because yesterday's case is technically still open, and today has to compensate for whatever went wrong. You get through a good morning, maybe a real moment of prayer that felt honest and warm, and for an hour or two the case looks a little stronger. Then something happens. You lose your patience with your kids, or you scroll somewhere you should not have gone, or you catch yourself gossiping about someone in a way that felt justified in the moment but sounds ugly in hindsight. And the case shifts again. The verdict, if there even is one, always feels like it is still pending. Always one bad day away from being overturned. That is not a small, occasional feeling for a lot of people. For some, it is the entire emotional architecture of their spiritual life, and they have simply never had language for it before. They call it conviction, or growth, or taking their faith seriously, when what it actually is, underneath all of that vocabulary, is a courtroom that never lets the gavel fall. Paul is trying to tell the Galatians something that should have ended that courtroom permanently. And it is worth reading his words with fresh eyes, because they are more radical than familiarity usually allows them to feel. The verdict does not come from the performance. The verdict is received through faith in Christ. Notice the direction of that sentence. Received, not earned. A verdict that arrives from outside you and is handed to you, rather than one you slowly construct out of your own behavior and hope holds up under scrutiny. That reversal is lesson 14. And it is the hinge this entire letter turns on. The case was never something you were meant to win through your own effort. It was already decided. In Christ. Before your good days and your bad days ever entered the courtroom at all. Paul makes this point even sharper a little further into the letter, using a phrase that deserves to be read slowly. Before this faith came, he writes, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until faith should be revealed. Held in custody, locked up. That is not gentle language. That is the language of someone describing a genuine imprisonment. And it tells you something important about how Paul understood the weight of trying to establish your own standing before God through your own effort. It does not simply fail to work. It functions like a prison, holding a person captive to an endless, unwinnable trial. And then faith came, and the door opened. And the astonishing claim at the center of this letter is that the door opened not because the prisoner finally gathered enough good behavior to deserve release, but because someone else already paid whatever the case required. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living as though the verdict is still pending. And if you have ever felt it, you already know it does not feel like humility from the inside. It feels like fear wearing humility as a disguise. It produces people who cannot rest, who cannot receive a compliment without deflecting it, who cannot sit quietly with God without immediately reaching for the next thing they need to fix or prove or improve before they feel safe enough to simply be present. It produces exhausted believers who technically agree that grace is true while living every single day as though it is still being decided. Real peace does not come from finally winning today's trial. It comes from discovering the trial already ended. And it ended before you had done anything at all to deserve the outcome. That quiet promise is lesson 15. Sitting underneath everything Paul has written so far in this letter. This does not mean your choices stop mattering. Paul will spend later chapters of this same letter talking with total seriousness about walking by the Spirit, about bearing good fruit, about the real difference between a life shaped by faith and a life shaped by the flesh. None of that disappears. But there is a difference, an enormous difference, between living rightly because you are trying to win a verdict and living rightly because the verdict has already been handed down in your favor and you are simply learning to walk like someone who knows it. Picture two different people sitting in the same church service on an ordinary Sunday morning. Both of them love God. Both of them are trying, in their own way, to live faithfully. One of them is quietly building a case, gathering evidence of their own sincerity, hoping the weight of this week's effort outpaces the weight of this week's failure. The other one is sitting there simply grateful, resting inside a verdict they did not write and could never have written on their own, free to fail today without the entire case collapsing, because the case was never resting on today in the first place. Same room, same songs, same Bible open on their laps, and an entirely different world happening underneath the surface, depending on which courtroom they believe they are standing in. Paul wrote this letter to close one of those courtrooms forever. Not because the truth does not matter, not because holiness does not matter, but because a verdict you are still trying to earn will eventually crush the very people it was supposed to set free. And Paul had personally lived long enough inside that particular courtroom to know exactly how heavy its walls could get. There is a verse tucked into the middle of this letter that most people have heard quoted far more often than they have actually let themselves feel. "I have been crucified with Christ," Paul writes, "and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." It is the kind of line that gets printed on coffee mugs and painted on walls. And something about that familiarity has quietly drained the shock out of it. So, slow down for a moment and actually picture what Paul is describing. Because crucifixion was not a poetic metaphor in the world he lived in. It was one of the most brutal methods of execution the ancient world had ever devised, reserved for criminals and rebels. A public and agonizing death meant to be seen by everyone passing by. That is the image Paul chooses, deliberately, to describe what happened to him. He is not saying his behavior improved. He is saying something died. This matters because most people, when they first hear this verse, quietly translate it into something gentler and easier to manage. They hear it as Paul trying harder now. Paul finally getting serious about discipleship. Paul turning over a new leaf and committing himself more fully to good habits. But that reading misses the actual claim entirely. Paul is not describing self-improvement. He is describing an execution. And the thing that got executed was not his sin in some abstract sense. It was a version of himself. The version that had once measured his worth by his own zeal. The version that had once built an entire identity out of being more devoted, more advanced, more impressive than everyone else in the room. That version, Paul says, is dead, not improved. Not managed, dead. Lesson 16 lives in that distinction. And it is one of the most freeing truths in the entire letter, if a person can actually let it land. The cross does not simply forgive the version of you that keeps performing for approval. It ends that version's reign completely. Think for a moment about what it actually feels like to live as a performing self. Because most people who carry this burden have never had a clear name for it. It is the version of you that walks into a room and instantly, almost involuntarily, starts calculating how you are being perceived. The version that cannot admit a doubt out loud because doubt might make you look less faithful than everyone assumes you are. The version that smiles through genuine exhaustion because looking joyful has quietly become part of the job description of being a good Christian. The version that apologizes for crying, apologizes for struggling, apologizes for being a real human being with real limits. Because somewhere along the way, you absorbed the belief that spiritual maturity means never letting anyone see the actual weight you are carrying. That self is exhausting to maintain, because it requires constant management. It has to keep track of its own image the way a company manages a brand. Always aware of how the next post, the next conversation, the next public moment might affect the story other people are telling about you. And Paul's claim in this verse is not that this self needs a better strategy for managing itself more successfully. His claim is that this self was nailed to a cross and it does not get to run your life anymore. You do not need to perform better on that particular stage. The stage itself no longer decides who you are. That is lesson 17. And it deserves to be said plainly, because it is easy to misunderstand in the direction of pressure rather than freedom. This does not mean the desire for approval simply vanishes the moment someone becomes a believer. Paul was not writing to people who had stopped caring what others thought of them. And neither is this chapter suggesting that struggle disappears the instant you understand this verse. What changes is the foundation underneath the struggle. The performing self can still whisper. It can still show up uninvited at family gatherings, in ministry meetings, in the quiet moments right before you walk into church wondering if you look put together enough. But it no longer holds the deed to the house. It is a trespasser now, not the owner. And there is enormous freedom in learning to recognize the difference. There is a second half to this verse that gets quoted far less often than the first. And it might actually be the more important half. I no longer live, Paul says, but Christ lives in me. This is not simply the story of an old self dying and leaving a vacancy behind. Something moved in. Someone moved in. The life Paul now describes living is not his own effort at being a better version of himself. It is Christ's life, active and present inside him. And Paul is careful to specify how that life is actually accessed. The life I now live in the body. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Notice the order of that sentence one more time, because it carries the entire weight of this letter inside it. Loved me, gave himself for me. Not because Paul had already proven himself worthy of that love through his zeal or his advancement or his sincerity. The love came first, poured out toward a man who was, by his own admission, still actively persecuting the church when grace found him. The performing self had spent years trying to earn a love that, it turns out, had already been given before there was anything to earn it with. The new life you are being invited into is not an improved performance on the same old stage. It is a completely different way of existing, rooted in someone else's love rather than your own ongoing effort to secure it. That is lesson 18, and it might be the hardest one to actually believe, even after understanding it intellectually. This is worth sitting with honestly, because letting go of the performing self can feel strangely frightening, even for people who are exhausted by it. That self, as heavy as it is to carry, has also felt like protection for a long time. If your worth depends on your performance, at least you have some sense of control over it. You can work harder. You can try again tomorrow. You can always do one more thing to shore up the case. But if your worth depends entirely on being loved by someone who already gave everything before you did anything to deserve it, there is nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, nothing left to prove. That kind of freedom can feel like falling before it feels like rest. Paul had walked through that exact fall himself. The man who once measured his life by his own advancement had to watch that entire identity die on a road outside Damascus. And what came after it was not a stronger, more polished version of the old Paul. It was someone new, living a life he freely admits was no longer his own to manage, sustained by a love he never had to earn in the first place and could never have earned, no matter how zealous he had once been. That is what it means to say, I have been crucified with Christ. Not a better performance, a death, and on the other side of that death, a life finally free enough to stop auditioning for a love that was already, completely, irreversibly given. The sky over the land where Abraham lived would have been darker than almost anyone alive today has ever seen darkness. No cities glowing on the horizon. No light pollution stealing the edges off the stars. Just an old man standing outside his tent, looking up at something that must have felt like it went on forever. He was old enough by now that most of the ordinary hopes of a life had already come and gone. No, son, A wife who had stopped believing her body would ever do what bodies are supposed to do. A promise that had been spoken to him years earlier, back when it still seemed reasonable that God might act on it soon. And now, standing outside that tent, the promise must have felt less like a certainty and more like a memory of something he used to believe more easily. And God told him to look up, count the stars. If you are able to count them, so shall your offspring be. There was nothing about that moment that made logical sense. Abraham had no evidence in front of him except a sky. No child yet conceived. No physical sign on his body. No ritual completed. Nothing he could point to and say, "Here, this is my proof." Just a voice, and a sky full of an impossible number of lights, and a decision that had to be made in the space between the two. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Paul reaches back into this exact story now, because he knows the agitators in Galatia were almost certainly using Abraham to make their own case. If circumcision had mattered enough for Abraham to receive it as a sign of the covenant, why would it not matter for anyone who wanted to claim Abraham's blessing? It must have sounded, on the surface, like a fairly solid argument. Paul answers it not by dismissing Abraham, but by asking the Galatians to look more carefully at the order of events. Because the order turns out to change everything. The belief came first. The night under the stars came first. No mark on his body yet. No badge of any kind yet. Just a man standing in the dark, trusting a voice that had made him a promise he had absolutely no ability to guarantee on his own. Before Abraham could point to a badge, he already had a promise, and the promise was doing all the work. That is lesson 19, and it is worth letting it sit in the quiet for a moment before moving forward. The same way, the promise itself must have sat in Abraham's chest long before there was anything visible to show for it. This is worth slowing down on, because it is easy to treat Abraham as a distant historical figure with a story that has little bearing on an ordinary life today. But think about what was actually being asked of him in that moment. He was not being asked to complete a checklist. He was being asked to trust a God he could not see, about a future he could not control, using nothing but the word he had been given. There was no visible proof yet. No evidence he could show a skeptical neighbor, just a promise and a decision to believe it. The sign came later. Genesis is very clear about the timeline, and Paul is counting on the Galatians to know their own scriptures well enough to notice it. The covenant of circumcision does not appear until years after this moment of belief, given to Abraham as a seal, a physical confirmation of a righteousness he had already received simply by trusting God's word. The sign was never the source of his standing before God. It was evidence of a standing that already existed. This distinction is not a small technicality. It is the entire argument Paul is building. If the sign came after the promise and confirmed something that already belonged to Abraham through faith, then anyone in Galatia insisting that Gentile believers needed that same sign in order to belong to God's family had the story backward. They were treating the seal as though it were the substance, mistaking the badge for the very thing the badge was only ever meant to point toward. Faith comes before religious performance, not after it. And no amount of performance can retroactively become the thing faith was always meant to be. That is lesson 20, and it deserves to be stated as plainly as Paul states it himself. There is something in this that reaches far beyond the specific argument about circumcision, something that touches nearly every version of the trap this entire letter has been describing. Think about how naturally the human mind reaches for proof. A person believes something real happens in their heart when they come to faith. Some genuine encounter with grace. Some real turning toward God. And almost immediately, a quiet, anxious voice starts asking for evidence. How do I know it really happened? What can I point to that would convince someone else? Or convince myself on a hard day that this was real? And so the search begins for a badge. Something visible, something measurable. A certain number of years of consistent devotion. A certain public reputation for holiness. A certain vocabulary that marks a person as clearly, unmistakably serious about their faith. None of that is necessarily wrong on its own. The problem is not that visible fruit exists in a genuine life of faith. The problem comes when the badge quietly starts to feel like the actual foundation. The thing a person is truly resting their standing with God upon, rather than simply the natural evidence of a promise they already believed long before any of it was visible to anyone watching. Paul makes one more move in this argument that deserves careful attention, because it protects this entire letter from becoming an attack on Scripture rather than a defense of it. He does not say the promise made the law meaningless or that God's earlier dealings with his people were some kind of mistake later corrected. He asks the Galatians to consider the timeline honestly. The covenant with Abraham came first, sealed by God's own word. The law came 430 years later. And Paul is careful to say that a later law cannot set aside a covenant previously established by God, so as to do away with the promise. There is a detail buried in that phrase that deserves its own attention, because it answers a question a careful listener might already be asking. If the law came so long after the promise, what was Israel supposed to do with itself during those 430 years? Were they simply waiting, doing nothing, with no structure and no identity? That was never how it worked. The promise did not sit idle during that stretch of history. It was being carried, protected, and passed down through an entire people who were being shaped, generation after generation, into a family capable of eventually receiving what had been spoken to one man under one sky. The waiting itself was doing something. It was not empty time. That waiting carries its own lesson. One easy to miss because it hides inside a number most listeners pass over quickly. A promise can spend centuries looking unfulfilled without ever actually being broken. That is lesson 21. And it belongs to anyone who has ever wondered whether the amount of time something has taken is proof that God has forgotten it. Abraham's descendants did not receive the full weight of that promise in his lifetime, or his son's lifetime, or for many lifetimes after that. The delay was not evidence of absence. It was the shape the promise took on its way to becoming visible. This chapter closes with a picture worth carrying forward. Somewhere in a quiet stretch of desert, an old man stood outside his tent, looked up at a sky full of more stars than he could ever count, and believed a promise he had no way to prove was true. No badge yet, no visible sign. Just a man taking God at his word before there was anything else to point to, and a promise that would go on being carried, patiently, for centuries. Long after that particular night had ended, that is where this story of faith actually begins, and everything that came afterward. Every sign, every law, every mark carried in the flesh, was meant to serve that original promise, never to replace it. There is a question hanging over everything Paul has said so far, and he knows the Galatians are almost certainly asking it out loud by this point in the letter. If the promise came first, If faith alone was enough for Abraham, long before there was any law to keep, then why was the law given at all? What was the point of it? This is the moment where Paul has to be more careful than at almost any other point in this letter, because the wrong answer here could do enormous damage. It would be easy, and it would be lazy, to simply say the law was a mistake, or a burden God regretted giving, or evidence that the old covenant had failed and was quietly being replaced by something better. That reading has done real harm wherever it has been taught, because it turns the very scriptures Jesus himself quoted and honored into an embarrassment to be explained away rather than a gift to be understood rightly. Paul does not go there. Instead, he reaches for a picture that would have been instantly familiar to anyone in his original audience. The law was our guardian, he writes, until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. The word Paul uses here describes a very specific role in the ancient world, one that has no perfect equivalent in modern language. Though the picture is not hard to imagine, in a wealthy household, a young child was often placed under the daily supervision of a guardian, someone whose job was not to raise the child forever, but to walk that child safely to school, to enforce discipline along the way, to keep watch until the child came of age and inherited what had already been promised to them from birth. The guardian was necessary. The guardian was not cruel or pointless, but the guardian was never meant to be permanent. And the guardian was never the point of the child's life. The inheritance was the point. The guardian only existed to get the child there safely. A guardian can walk beside a child faithfully for years, and still never be the one who owns the house. If the child grows up and mistakes the guardian for the father, they will spend their whole inheritance still waiting outside the door for permission to walk in. That picture is lesson 22, and it deserves to be held carefully. This is exactly the mistake Paul believed the agitators in Galatia were making, and it is worth being honest about how understandable that mistake actually was. The law had done real work in Israel's history. It had marked out a people. It had given them a shared identity in a world full of competing gods and competing ways of life. It had restrained behavior that would have torn that community apart from the inside. None of that was wasted or worthless. The guardian had done exactly what a guardian was supposed to do, faithfully, for a very long time. But a guardian was never given the authority to write anyone into the family in the first place. That authority belonged to the promise alone. And the promise had already been settled with Abraham centuries before. There was a guardian walking anyone, anywhere. Paul pushes the picture even further, and it is worth reading exactly what he says next, because it answers the deeper anxiety sitting underneath this whole argument. Before this faith came, he writes, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. No longer under a guardian. Not because the guardian failed. Because the child grew up and came into the inheritance, the guardian had been walking them toward the entire time. Confusing the guardian for the destination is the exact root of religious performance. And it explains why so many sincere, devoted people can spend an entire lifetime walking faithfully behind a guardian without ever actually walking through the door into the house. That confusion is lesson 23. And it closes out this chapter. Think about what it would look like for a grown adult to still be standing outside a house, waiting for permission from a guardian who was only ever hired to walk them there as a child. It would be strange. It would be sad. Everyone watching would want to tell that person the truth. You already belong inside. The guardian's job was finished the moment you arrived. You do not need another note of permission. You do not need to prove anything further to the person whose entire task was simply to get you here safely. That is precisely the picture Paul is holding up in front of the Galatians. Some of them, without fully realizing it, were being convinced to stand outside a door that had already been opened for them, waiting for one more sign of approval from a guardian whose job description had never included deciding who gets to walk inside. The badge some of them were being told they needed was never the key to the house. It had, at best, only ever been part of how the guardian did his work along the way. Paul is not tearing down the law here. He is placing it exactly where it was always meant to stand. Faithful, necessary, and temporary within his argument to Gentile believers now in Christ. Doing real work in its season and then stepping aside the moment the promise it had been pointing toward finally arrived in full. A guardian who refuses to step aside once the child comes of age has stopped being a guardian and become something closer to a jailer. And that, more than anything else, is the trap Paul is trying to pull the Galatians back out of before it closes completely around them. There is a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It is the loneliness of walking into your own family's house and feeling, somewhere underneath the surface, like a guest who has not quite proven they belong there yet. Every gesture measured, every silence slightly too long. A quiet sense that acceptance is always one mistake away from being withdrawn. That the warmth in the room is conditional on continuing to earn it. Meal after meal, visit after visit. For as long as the relationship lasts, Paul knows exactly what that feeling does to a person. And in this chapter, he offers the Galatians a picture meant to end it permanently. He starts with something almost tender for a letter that has been this urgent. God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Adoption. It is worth pausing on that word, because in the world Paul was writing to, adoption carried a legal weight that modern readers often miss entirely. In Roman culture, an adopted son was not treated as a lesser or provisional member of the family. Once adopted, all previous debts were cancelled. All former identity was legally erased, and the adopted son received full inheritance rights. In many cases, equal to or even more secure than the rights of a son born naturally into the family. Because adoption had been a deliberate, chosen, legally binding act rather than an accident of birth. Nobody looked at an adopted son in that world and treated his place in the family as somehow more fragile than a biological son's place. If anything, it was the opposite. He was there because he had been chosen, on purpose, into a permanent and legally unbreakable bond. This is the language Paul reaches for to describe what has happened to every person who belongs to Christ. And it matters enormously that he does not stop at forgiveness. Forgiveness alone might leave a person feeling merely tolerated, a debt cancelled, but a relationship still somewhat distant. Paul goes further. Because you are his sons, he writes, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. The Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. Abba was warm and familial, the kind of word a child uses reaching for a parent. Nothing formal or distant about it. Paul is saying that the Spirit living inside every believer produces exactly that kind of instinctive, unguarded closeness. not the careful language of someone still trying to prove they belong, but the immediate cry of a child who already knows whose house they are standing in. Religious performance quietly turns the Father's house into an audition room, a place where you never fully relax because the evaluation never technically ends. Galatians turns it back into a home. That is lesson 24. And it is one of the most direct answers this letter gives to the exhaustion so many people carry without ever naming it. It is worth being honest about how deeply this particular wound runs for a lot of people, because it rarely stays confined to spiritual life alone. Someone who grew up needing to earn a parent's approval, who learned early that love arrived attached to conditions. That affection had to be won through good behavior or good grades, or simply staying quiet enough not to cause trouble. Will often carry that exact same posture straight into their relationship with God without ever noticing the transfer happened. They will read about grace, agree with it intellectually, and still walk into church every week performing for an approval. They have never actually learned how to simply receive. Paul is speaking directly into that wound. Whether or not he knew the specific shape it takes in every generation that would eventually read this letter. So you are no longer a slave, he writes, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. An heir, not a candidate for inheritance. Still waiting to see if this season's performance qualifies them. An heir, already, now, on the basis of something that had nothing to do with a track record built over time. A person is not adopted into God's family because they finally accumulated enough evidence of belonging. They are adopted first, and everything that looks like belonging afterward, every act of obedience, every moment of worship, every quiet returning to God after a hard week, flows out of a relationship that was already secured before any of it began. That order is lesson 25. And it deserves to be said as plainly as Paul says it himself. This reorders something that most performance-driven faith gets exactly backward. In the audition room, the behavior comes first, and belonging is the prize you are hoping to eventually win if you perform well enough for long enough. In the Father's house, belonging comes first, spoken and settled, and everything else becomes the natural outflow of a child who is no longer trying to become part of the family, but is simply learning, sometimes slowly and imperfectly, how to live like someone who already is. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that lifts the moment this order gets corrected. Even if the correction takes years to fully settle into a person's bones, it is the exhaustion of no longer needing today to be a good enough performance to secure tomorrow's welcome. A child who has to earn their place at the table every single morning will never fully relax at that table, no matter how good the meal is. But a child who already knows the house belongs to them, who already knows their name is written into the family in a way nothing they do today could unwrite. We can finally sit down and actually taste the food in front of them, instead of anxiously wondering whether they have done enough yet to deserve a seat. There is one more piece of this picture Paul refuses to leave out, and it might be the most practical thing in the whole chapter. An heir, he writes, as long as they are underage, is no different from a slave. Although they own the whole estate, they are subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by their father. The inheritance was theirs the entire time. Even during the years it did not feel like it. Even during the season when they were still being trained and corrected and told what to do by people other than the father himself. A person can be a true and secure heir long before they feel like one. And the feeling catching up to the reality is not the same thing as the reality arriving late. That gap between what is legally, permanently true, and what a person actually feels on an ordinary Tuesday is lesson 26. And it matters because so many believers assume the feeling of belonging is the proof of belonging, when the feeling is often simply the last thing to arrive, not the first. Paul is not describing a distant theological technicality. He is describing the difference between a person who spends their entire life standing outside a door, hoping today's effort might finally be enough, and a person who has already heard the words that end that particular kind of fear completely. You are no longer a slave. You are a son. You are a daughter. And since you already belong here, the inheritance was never something you needed to earn in the first place. It was simply something you needed to finally believe was already yours, and start living like you actually trust it. Somebody in Galatia is already misusing this letter before Paul has even finished writing it. He can feel it coming. The way a parent can feel a conversation heading somewhere dangerous before a single wrong word has actually been said. Everything he has just told them about adoption, about the verdict already settled, about no longer needing to earn a place at the table, is true. And he knows exactly how easily true things get twisted into an excuse. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. He writes, "Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Then, almost in the same breath, he pivots hard in the other direction. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Picture what that second sentence was actually walking into. Somewhere in that community, there was almost, if none of it depends on performance, why bother restraining anything? If the case is already closed, why hold back? That person was sitting in the room when this letter got read aloud, and Paul knew it. Christian freedom was never meant to be the right to serve yourself. It was always meant to be the power to love someone else without needing that love to become a performance either you or they are being secretly graded on. That correction is lesson 27, and it is one of the most important in the entire letter, because getting it wrong in either direction causes real damage. This distinction matters more than it might first appear, because there are really two ways to misunderstand grace. And Paul has now confronted both of them in the same letter. The first misunderstanding, the one the agitators were pushing, treats grace as insufficient on its own, something that needs an extra requirement added beside it before it can be trusted. The second misunderstanding treats grace as a license, an excuse to stop caring about how you actually live because the outcome was already decided regardless. Paul spends this entire letter walking a narrow path directly between both ditches, refusing to let the Galatians fall into either one. Notice what he does not say. He does not say now that you are free, holiness no longer matters. He does not say obedience was only ever a legalistic trap and can be safely abandoned now that grace has arrived. What he says instead is more precise, in some ways, more demanding. Serve one another humbly in love. Freedom was never given so a person could finally stop caring about how they treat other people. It was given so a person could finally love other people without an anxious motive quietly running underneath the surface. Think about the difference between two people who both end up doing the exact same kind act on a given day. One of them helps a struggling neighbor because some part of them is quietly keeping score, hoping this act of service will count towards something, will prove something. will add another piece of evidence to a case they are still, even now, secretly trying to win. The other helps that same neighbor simply because love moved them to do it. With nothing to prove and nothing riding on the outcome except the neighbor's actual well-being. From the outside, the two acts look identical. From the inside, they could not be more different. Grace does not make obedience unnecessary. Grace makes obedience honest. That single sentence is lesson 28. And it might be the one line in this entire letter most worth memorizing. There is a warning that comes right after this. And it is sharper than most people remember when they quote the earlier parts of this chapter. If you bite and devour each other, Paul writes, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground in a community like this one. Not a single dramatic explosion, but something slower and meaner. Two believers, both technically agreeing that circumcision was not required, starting to eye each other differently anyway. One of them still quietly more comfortable around people who kept more of the old markers. The other quietly resentful of anyone who seemed to be clinging to the very system Paul had just spent 9 chapters dismantling. Small comments at first. A little less warmth extended across certain lines. Slowly, the same community that had once eaten freely at one table beginning to fracture again. Not over doctrine anymore, but over suspicion. Over who still seemed a little too attached to the old proof and who seemed a little too loose with the new freedom. That is what performance-based religion tends to do to a community over time. Even after the original argument has technically been settled, a group of people who are all secretly competing to prove their own spiritual worth rarely stays gentle with each other for long. Comparison breeds judgment. Judgment breeds distance. And distance, left unattended, eventually breeds exactly the kind of biting and devouring Paul is warning against. Freedom, real freedom, does the opposite. A person who is no longer anxiously trying to secure their own standing has far more room left over to actually notice the person standing next to them. They are not competing anymore, because there was never actually a contest to win in the first place. The case was already closed. And a community full of people who have genuinely stopped competing for approval tends to become, almost without anyone forcing it, a community that finally has enough room left to actually love one another the way this whole letter has been quietly building toward from the very first sentence. There is a list near the end of this letter that almost everyone who has spent time in church has heard quoted at some point, usually printed on a poster somewhere, often reduced to something closer to a moral checklist than what it was actually meant to be. Paul writes it out plainly. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It is worth noticing the word he chooses before he ever gets to that list, because the word carries almost the entire weight of what this final chapter is trying to say. Fruit, not works, not achievements, not badges. Fruit. A badge can be manufactured overnight. Someone can put one on this morning and take it off tonight, and nobody watching would necessarily know the difference. A performance can be rehearsed, timed, adjusted for whoever happens to be in the room that day. But nobody has ever manufactured fruit. Fruit does not respond to effort the way a performance does. It responds to roots, to soil, to time, to a slow and mostly invisible process that has almost nothing to do with how hard a person tries to make it appear on the outside, faster than it is actually growing on the inside. A mask can be produced in a moment. Fruit has to be grown, and growing something always takes longer than most people are comfortable waiting. That single distinction is lesson 29. And it might be the most important correction in this entire closing chapter. This distinction matters enormously, because it would be entirely possible to read this list Paul just wrote and turn it into exactly the trap this whole letter has been trying to dismantle from the very first sentence. It would be easy to hear love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and quietly start running a new inventory. Do I have enough joy today? Was I patient enough this week? Am I gentle enough compared to the person sitting next to me in this pew? That kind of scorekeeping would simply rebuild the same courtroom this letter spent so many chapters trying to close. Dressed up now in the language of spiritual fruit instead of circumcision, but functioning exactly the same way underneath. Paul is not handing the Galatians a new checklist to perform. He is describing what naturally grows in a life that has actually stopped performing. Notice something else about the specific word he uses. It is fruit. Singular, not fruit. Plural. He is not describing 9 separate achievements a person can pursue one at a time, checking each one off as they master it before moving on to the next. He is describing a single, unified harvest, all of it growing together out of the same root system. The way an apple tree does not produce love on one branch and patience on another. One tree, one root, many expressions of the same underlying life. And what is that root? Paul has already told the Galatians several chapters earlier, in words that now come flooding back with their full weight. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The fruit described here is not the harvest of a person trying harder to be good. It is the harvest of a person whose old performing self has genuinely died, making room for a different life to take root and grow in its place. Fruit is what grows in a life that is no longer rooted in fear. That closing truth is lesson 30, and it might be the one worth carrying furthest into an ordinary week long after this particular chapter has been forgotten. Think about what fear actually does to growth. In a garden or in a soul, a plant that is constantly dug up to check whether its roots are developing properly will never actually develop properly, because the checking itself disturbs the very growth it is trying to measure. A person who is constantly examining whether they have enough patience yet, enough joy yet, enough self-control yet, is doing the exact same thing to their own soul, pulling up the roots again and again in an anxious search for proof, never allowing enough undisturbed time in the ground for anything real to actually take hold. Paul is inviting the Galatians into something almost the opposite of anxious inspection. Stop digging. Stop checking. Stay planted in the thing that is actually true. That you are already loved, already adopted, already free. And let that settled reality do its slow and mostly invisible work over time. The fruit will come. It always comes. Eventually. In a life that has stopped treating growth as something to manufacture and started treating it as something to simply receive, season after season, in its own unhurried time. This is where the whole letter finally arrives. And it is worth standing back now to see the full shape of the journey Paul has walked the Galatians through. A letter that opened with no greeting at all, urgent enough to skip straight past comfort. A gospel distorted by one small addition. wearing Christ's face while quietly asking for something more. A man who once measured his worth by his own zeal, until grace interrupted him on a road he had no plans to turn back from. A table in Antioch where even an apostle briefly forgot who he already belonged to. A courtroom that had already reached its verdict long before the case seemed finished. A cross that did not simply forgive a performing self, but ended its reign completely. A tent under a sky full of stars, where a promise arrived before any badge ever could, and kept being carried faithfully through centuries that must have felt like waiting for nothing. A guardian who did real and necessary work, and then, faithfully, stepped aside. A father's house that was never an audition room to begin with, where the inheritance was real, long before it ever felt real. A freedom never meant to be used for indulgence, but for a love finally honest enough to stop keeping score. And now, at the very end, a garden, growing quietly, producing what no performance ever could. The freedom of Galatians was never the freedom to stop caring about holiness. It is the freedom to stop using holiness as a costume. You do not have to perform your way into the Father's house. In Christ, the door has already been opened. Now learn to live like someone who is home. If something in this letter reached a place in you that does not usually get reached, that is worth paying attention to, share it with the person you already thought of while you were listening. The one still standing in an audition room, still trying to prove they belong somewhere they were already welcomed into a long time ago. We will see you in the next one.